back, Crosspoint students. My name is Sam Crandall, and I have the opportunity to serve on our students team. We're in the last week of our series on comparison, the thief of everything, where we've been talking about all the ways we can get caught up with comparison and what we can do to break free from it. Before we jump in, I want you to think for just a moment about this question. Who is somebody that you look up to right now? Or maybe who is someone you used to look up to when you were younger? It could be an athlete, actor, musician, influencer, content creator, what have you, maybe even someone in your day-to-day life. This list is non-exhaustive, but think, who is someone that you admire for what they do? You watch them do what they're known for and you think, gosh, I wish I could be just like them. When I was a student, comparison was something I struggled with big time. Whether it came to academics, there always seemed to be someone smarter than me or who did better on a project than me, or in friend groups, comparing myself to people because of their personality. Was I funny enough, outgoing enough, interesting enough? I grew up in the all-star dance world, which if that means anything to you, then you know comparison comes with the territory. And if it doesn't, let me tell you, competitive cheer and dance social dynamics are no joke. I compared myself to other people's style, which now looking back, I acknowledge my style was bad. Actually, it was just like non-existent to say, but you get the point. There's this endless checklist that was in my life that I was constantly comparing myself to and ultimately finding my worth and identity in. There seemed to be someone in each of these categories of what was important to me that served as a reminder of who I wasn't, regardless of the effort I felt like I was putting in to be someone different. I'm sure right now, wherever you might be joining from, you can think of someone that you almost idolize because you want, even wish you could be just like them. Right? At some point, though, living like this becomes exhausting, and we realize that our lives aren't the same as those we are aspiring to mimic. In other words, we can't compare. All month, we've been talking not just about comparing ourselves to others, but what the Bible has to say on this topic. Oftentimes, it's people we look up to that we get caught up with comparing ourselves to. I mean, that was so much of my high school career, comparing myself to people I thought highly of and I wanted to be more like. Of course, students, there's nothing wrong with looking up to someone, being inspired by them, or even hoping to be like them. This is why we put you with incredible small group leaders each week in hopes you have people to look up to. It's a great thing to have people you aspire to be more like, who can motivate you to make positive decisions, live a more full life, and ultimately draw closer to God. That's an incredible gift we have. The problem comes when comparison shows up and we start to belittle ourselves or who God made us to be. When we make the switch from looking up to them to thinking that in order for us to have worth, we have to achieve what they've achieved, do what they've done, or become like them. The reality is that kind of comparison will always leave us feeling like we're not enough. The more we look at them, the worse we feel about ourselves. I mean, that was my story in ultimately every aspect while I was a student. I was perpetually comparing myself, life situations, look, aesthetic, athleticism, literally everything to everyone all the time. It was exhausting and led to so much shame, insecurity, and just like a yuck feeling. Every day, you and I see people that we could look up to. Older students on our campus, siblings, that natural athlete on your team, maybe the straight A student that school seems to come so easily to. In my situation, it wasn't necessarily an unobtainable celebrity, rather my peers and even some of my closest friends. Maybe you can relate. What's crazy is on my own, I felt okay about who I was and how my life was, but the moment I fell down the wormhole of comparison, in just an instant, I could suddenly feel like I was not enough. And maybe right now, you're feeling like you're not enough in whatever category that might be. Whether that's being cool enough, smart enough, established enough, attractive enough, talented enough, or just not good enough. I'm overwhelmed just thinking about how many avenues we can trick ourselves into thinking we're not enough because those are lies and they're not from God. We're so caught up in comparison with them that it changes the way we see us. It becomes the thief of self-esteem, self-worth, and confidence. And what's worse is that it doesn't seem to end. As soon as we start to feel like we're smart enough, we'll look around and think we're not popular enough. As soon as we think we're popular enough, we'll start to look around and think we're not accomplished enough. Somehow it will never be enough. If that sounds life-sucking, it's because it is. It's the thief of everything, and it's not how you and I are meant to be living our lives. There's got to be a better way, right? The question is, how do we break out of this cycle of never feeling like we're enough? And what does the Bible have to say on this topic? Well, today we're going to take a look at something Paul, a leader in the early church, wrote to other Christians thousands of years ago. The people he wrote to in this particular letter were dealing with the same temptation to compare themselves to others, similarly as we do here in modern times. In this case, they were caught up with comparing themselves to people around them, especially people who didn't share the same faith as them. Sound familiar? So while this particular verse is referencing Christians comparing themselves to non-Christians, we can still apply these words to our lives. Paul says this in Romans 12, verse 2. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Paul tells them to not copy the people around them. Other translations use verbiage such as do not conform. And he could have stopped there with just a simple, hey, don't copy the behaviors of this world, and moved on. I mean, wouldn't all of our lives be a lot less stressful if we quit caring so much about what everyone around us was doing? But Paul didn't stop there because he knew this was something easier said than done, because the same way we fight against comparison, the people of Rome who Paul is writing to struggled the same way. So if we look back at that verse, Paul continues on to say, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Paul's not just talking about a good thing to do. Stop copying, comparing to others. He's talking about a new way of thinking. He's talking about a transformation, aka a major change. A change into what? A whole new person. But how? Well, it starts by allowing God to change the way we think. See, Paul put a little bit of focus on them. He said, don't conform or compare to them. But Paul put a lot of focus on you. He said, let God transform you. It's a shift in focus to go from comparing yourself to them to allowing God to transform you. When you and I start to understand what God says about us and how he sees us, it has the potential to change everything. When old thinking is replaced by new thinking, it takes our focus off of someone else's life and moves it towards who God created us to be. We can choose to live with the mindset every day by being intentional about the things we think about, thanking God for the good in our lives and how he uniquely created each of us. This is how we break the cycle of comparison and miss thinking that we are not enough. This is how we eliminate the thief of everything. But I want you to think about a few key words Paul uses in between talking about them and talking about you. But let God transform you. This means you decide to let him. You proactively determine to move in a different direction towards the Creator. Think of it this way. Choose to see yourself the way God does. This is what it's like when we choose to compare ourselves to others. We focus on others' talents, others' looks, others' friends, others' grades, their personalities, what they have. However, when we choose to see ourselves the way God sees us, it's different. We focus on God's love for us, the worth God assigns to us, how valuable God says we are, God's purpose for our lives, the gifts and talents that God has given us. This is much more valuable a place to focus and for you to build your perspective on these thoughts versus the ones of comparison, because these are the truths rooted in God's grace and kindness. Let's jump back into Romans chapter 12, verses 3 through 5, which describe how we are all parts of the body of Christ that serve varying purposes, because we are created uniquely. As we continue on, though, with verse 6, Paul says this: so since we find ourselves fashioned into all these excellently formed and marvelously functioning parts in Christ's body, let's just go ahead and be what we are made to be without enviously or pridefully comparing ourselves with each other or trying to be something we aren't. Paul is essentially saying, let's be who we were made to be, because we are made by God and we are loved by God. We were formed and created with specific gifts and traits that make us more than enough. The more we can focus on that, the more it will change our perspective on comparison and eventually transform us into being in alignment with God's heart for us. Believing this truth has the potential to help you break free from comparison and send the thief straight to jail. It also has the power to help you change your thinking into believing that you're enough. Today, let's start by trying two things. First, identify what's not true in order to really change your thinking and start believing what is true about you. You've got to first identify what's not. Ask yourself, what areas of my life leave me feeling like I'm not enough? Look for the places in your life that leave room for you to compare. Also, consider some of the negative things you think about yourself on a regular basis. Things like not being smart enough, attractive enough, clever enough, whatever lies seem to creep into your head. Second, replace old thoughts with new ones. Identify the negative thought and then come up with something positive to replace it with. Here's an example. I'm a loyal friend, or I'm patient, or I'm really gifted musically. But most importantly, you can replace your thoughts with truths about who God says you are. Because the Bible quite literally allows us to know truths like the following. I am loved and God says so. I am a child of the King. God considers me a friend. I am important to God. God made me with incredible gifts. The Spirit of God lives in me. You were made by God, and you were made to be you through Him. Rooting our thinking in biblical truth can allow us to break free from the cycle of comparison. And this may not be easy at first, but ask God to help you, invite Him into that. You may have to find a place where you can write down these truths and say them out loud over and over again. One day they will sink in. Over time, I think you'll begin to see God open your eyes to more amazing things about who you are and how God created you. You'll begin to see that to God, you're enough. Can we agree this is much more freeing and less draining way to live? Imagine if instead of living with a thief, you started living in freedom. Actively choose to see yourself the way God sees you, because God sees and knows your worth, value, and incredible love always. Students, thank you so much for letting me hang out. Your student pastor is going to make their way back up and pray for your small groups.